The chains were heavy, industrial grade, the kind used to secure cargo ships. They wrapped around Peter Jaggers' body like metal serpents, binding him to sandbags that would drag him to the bottom of a Free State dam. On October 15, 2024, when divers finally pulled his waterlogged corpse from the murky depths, the man who once ruled Cape Town's underworld with an iron fist had been reduced to just another body in the water. But this wasn't your typical gang hit. This was something far more sinister, a message written in blood and chains from a Colombian cartel that had reached across continents to collect a debt worth 1 billion rand. Peter Jaggers wasn't supposed to end up like this. In the brutal hierarchy of Cape Town's gang world, he'd clawed his way to the top of the terrible Jaggers, one of the most feared street gangs on the Cape Flats. At 43, he commanded respect through violence and cocaine, tons of it, floating in waterproof packages off the western Cape coast, dropped by container ships in the dead of night. But somewhere between the ocean drops and the cartel's counting rooms, 700 kilograms of pure Colombian cocaine had vanished into thin air. And in the world of international drug trafficking, that kind of mistake doesn't just cost money, it costs lives. The story begins not with Jaggers, but with the world that created him. Picture the Cape Flats in the 1990s, a sprawling wasteland of poverty where apartheid's architects had dumped entire communities like human garbage. Here, in neighborhoods like Netreg and Bishop Lavis, unemployment hit 70%. Kids grew up in matchbox houses crammed with 3 generations, where dinner was often just white bread and sugar water. Hope was a luxury few could afford. The gangs offered what the government couldn't: protection, purpose, and cold, hard cash. They called themselves the Numbers, the 26s, 27s, and 28s, prison gangs that had spilled onto the streets like blood from an open wound. By the time young Peter Jaggers came of age in this concrete jungle, the gang structures had evolved into something more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. The old prison codes had merged with modern drug trafficking, creating hybrid organizations that operated like corporations with HR departments that happened to murder people. The terrible Jaggers emerged from this evolution, taking their name from a twisted joke about how they'd make their enemies dance before they died. Jaggers came up through this system, earning his stripes with the 28s before rising through the ranks of the terrible Jaggers. His ascent was marked by the kind of violence that makes headlines: drive-by shootings that left children dead, executions in broad daylight, firebombings of rival drug houses. By 2020, he'd transformed from street soldier to CEO of a criminal empire. The Jaggers weren't just thugs anymore. They were a sophisticated syndicate with international connections, military-grade weapons, and a specialty that would ultimately seal Jaggers' fate: maritime cocaine retrieval. Here's how it worked. Container ships crossing from South America would slow down as they passed the Cape of Good Hope. The coordinates would arrive via encrypted messages, precise to the meter. In the darkness, crew members, often low-paid sailors desperate for extra cash, would toss sealed packages overboard. Each bundle contained 20 to 50 kilograms of pure cocaine, wrapped in layers of waterproof plastic and equipped with GPS trackers and flotation devices. The packages were designed to bob just below the surface, invisible to patrol boats but findable by those who knew where to look. Jaggers' men would race out in fishing boats, their official papers all in order, pretending to cast nets while actually hauling in fortune after fortune of white powder. It was brilliant in its simplicity, exploiting South Africa's vast coastline and limited maritime enforcement. The authorities knew something was happening. Cocaine bales occasionally washed up on beaches, sometimes with curious great whites circling nearby, drawn by the chemical scent. But catching the retrievers in the act? That was nearly impossible in the vast darkness of the South Atlantic. The money was staggering. A single successful retrieval could net R50 million in street value. Jaggers took his cut, paid his soldiers, bribed the necessary officials, and invested the rest. He owned legitimate businesses, taxi companies, nightclubs, construction firms, that washed the drug money clean. He became a shadow mayor of Netreg, the man people came to when the government failed them, which was always. March 2024 should have been just another score. 6 fishermen aboard a small boat called the Berta Fishing Experience headed out past Cape Point, officially chasing yellowtail. The crew included Jaggers' cousin, trusted soldiers who'd done this dance a dozen times before. But this wasn't just another pickup. This was the big one: 700 kilograms in a single drop, enough cocaine to supply Cape Town for months. When the boat didn't return on schedule, when families started calling the authorities, when the National Sea Rescue Institute launched a desperate search, the cover story began to crack. The rescue operation became a media sensation. Helicopters swept the coastline. Naval vessels joined the search. For 3 days, South Africa held its breath, praying for the fishermen's safe return. Then, miraculously, they were found, alive, unharmed, claiming they'd simply run out of fuel. The media celebrated. Families wept with relief. But in the shadows, intelligence officers were connecting dots. These weren't fishermen. They were Jaggers' crew, and their rescue was anything but miraculous. City officials later revealed the truth. Jaggers had orchestrated an elaborate deception. While the Berta boat created a distraction with their fake emergency, another crew had retrieved the actual cocaine shipment. It was a shell game played on the high seas, designed to throw off surveillance and create plausible deniability. The stranded fisherman's story would explain why his men were so far out to sea, why they'd been gone so long, why maritime authorities had tracked their movements. Except this time, something went catastrophically wrong. When the Colombian Cartel's accountants tallied up their shipments, 700 kilos were missing. Maybe the second crew had stolen it. Maybe rival gangs had intercepted the pickup. Maybe the coordinates were wrong and the shipment was sitting on the ocean floor. The why didn't matter to the Colombians. All that mattered was that their cocaine, worth R1 billion on the street, was gone. And in their world, there are no acceptable excuses. The first signs of trouble came in late June. Jaggers became paranoid, switching cars daily, varying his routes, trusting no one. His soldiers noticed he'd stopped visiting his usual haunts. The man who once strutted through Netreg like he owned it, which in many ways he did, now moved like a ghost. He knew they were coming. The voice message arrived at Jaggers' home on July 3rd, delivered to his wife's phone with chilling clarity. A man with a thick South American accent, his words dripping with barely contained rage. "We're not playing. Your husband is on his way to South America. You have 24 hours to give me my stuff back, or you pay our 50 million. This is not a game. We know where your children go to school. We know where your mother shops. Return what you stole, or we take everything." By then, Jaggers was already gone. On June 30th, he'd kissed his family goodbye and boarded a flight from Cape Town to Johannesburg's OR Tambo Airport. He told his wife it was business, that he'd be back in a week. Security footage showed him calm, almost casual, as if heading to a routine meeting. In a way, he was. Intelligence reports suggested he'd been summoned by the cartel's representatives, promised safe passage if he could explain the missing shipment. But Jaggers knew better than to meet the Colombians directly. Instead, he'd arranged to meet with Bulgarian intermediaries at the Emperor's Palace Hotel, Eastern European crime bosses who'd helped broker the original deal, who might negotiate a solution. The Bulgarians had their own cocaine pipeline from South America, their own reasons to keep the peace between suppliers and distributors. He checked into the hotel on July 3rd, taking a suite on the 7th floor. Hotel staff later described him as nervous but professional, tipping well, ordering room service, making phone calls. That night, around 10 p.m., men arrived at his room. Foreigners, the hotel staff would later tell police, speaking in accented English. 3 of them, all wearing dark suits, all with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from carrying concealed weapons. Jaggers left with them willingly, or at least without visible struggle. Security cameras captured them walking through the lobby, Jaggers in the middle, the men forming a protective diamond around him. To any observer, it looked like a businessman being escorted by security. They got into a black Mercedes with tinted windows and drove away. Peter Jaggers was never seen alive again. Back in Cape Town, Netreg erupted. Within hours of the ransom demand, word had spread through the township's Byzantine communication networks. Jaggers might have been a violent criminal, but to many in his community, he was also Big Brother, the man who kept rival gangs at bay, who threw money at funerals and school fees, who represented a twisted form of order in the chaos. When the government abandoned you, when police either ignored you or shook you down, men like Jaggers filled the void. Protesters burned tires in the streets, demanding his release. Young men fired guns into the air, a traditional gang salute to a fallen leader. Social media exploded with theories. Maybe he'd faked his own death to escape the cartel. Maybe corrupt cops had sold him out. Maybe this was all part of some larger game between international crime syndicates. A photo began circulating on WhatsApp. A bloodied man claimed to be Jaggers, supposedly shot during a cash-in-transit heist. His family immediately debunked it, but the rumors persisted. The truth was simpler and more brutal. For 3 months, Jaggers' body lay at the bottom of that Free State dam, slowly decomposing while investigators chased ghosts. William "Billy" Peterson, his longtime associate and business partner, had vanished the same night, presumably taken as insurance or eliminated as a witness. Their families received sporadic messages, always demanding the same thing: return the drugs or pay the price. The Hawks, South Africa's elite investigative unit, worked the case from every angle. They traced phone records, analyzed financial transactions, interviewed anyone who'd done business with Jaggers. Colonel Katlego Mogale led the investigation, coordinating with Interpol and the DEA. The trail led through a maze of front companies and encrypted communications, touching 4 continents and dozens of criminal organizations. What emerged was a picture of South Africa's new criminal reality. This wasn't the old days of territory wars between local gangs. This was globalized crime, where a dispute over a cocaine shipment could trigger a kidnapping orchestrated from Bogota, executed by Bulgarians, and ending in a Free State dam. The cocaine highway that ran through Cape Town's waters connected directly to the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. When police divers finally found them on October 15th, the condition of the bodies told the whole story. This wasn't a negotiation gone wrong or a quick execution. The chains, the sandbags, the remote location, it all pointed to something more deliberate. The cartel had taken their time. They'd made Jaggers understand exactly what happens when you steal from the wrong people. The autopsy would reveal water in his lungs, meaning he was likely alive when he went into the water. They'd weighted him down and thrown him away like the garbage apartheid's planners had once thrown away entire communities. National Police Commissioner Fanny Mazamola announced the investigation with unusual candor. "We are working with our Colombian counterparts. This case represents a new evolution in organized crime in South Africa." It was a rare admission that South African crime had gone international, that the old boundaries between local gang violence and global drug cartels had dissolved like cocaine in water. The tentacles of this case reached everywhere. In Cape Town's courts, 20 members of the terrible Josters faced 145 counts of murder, their violent enforcement of Jaggers' empire laid bare. Prosecutors described a reign of terror that included drive-by shootings, execution-style killings, and the firebombing of rivals' homes. One case involved the murder of a pregnant woman, caught in crossfire during a territorial dispute. Another detailed how the gang had kidnapped and tortured a suspected informant for 3 days before dumping his body in a field. Forensic accountants traced money flows through Bulgarian banks and Caribbean shell companies. They found property purchases in Dubai, investments in legitimate businesses across South Africa, and bank accounts in Cyprus. The terrible Josters weren't just a street gang, they were a multinational corporation dealing in death. Intelligence analysts mapped the southern route, the Maritime highway that had turned Cape Town into a major cocaine transit hub. Ships from Santos and Cartagena would make unscheduled slowdowns off the African coast. Cocaine packages would splash into the dark water. Local gangs would retrieve them, cut them with cheaper substances, and distribute them across southern Africa. It was a pipeline worth billions, protected by corruption at every level. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came from Cape Town's Safety Committee member J.P. Smith. The city had known about the Maritime drops for years. They'd watched GPS coordinates, intercepted communications, even found cocaine bales washed up on beaches with curious sharks circling nearby. Yet the trade continued, protected by corruption and geography, feeding a monster that had grown too big to control. Smith admitted what everyone knew but no one would say. The authorities were outgunned, outmanned, and often outbought. In death, Jaggers became what he'd never been in life, a symbol. To law enforcement, he represented the new face of organized crime, globally connected, professionally run, utterly ruthless. To his enemies, he was proof that even kings could fall. To his community, he remained a contradiction, protector and predator, benefactor and destroyer. The cocaine? It was never recovered. Maybe Jaggers had hidden it, planning one last score. Maybe rival gangs had already moved it. Maybe it never existed at all, just numbers on a cartel spreadsheet that didn't add up. $1 billion worth of questions that would never be answered. Today, the terrible Josters continue their reign of terror, though weakened without their leader. New alliances form and dissolve like sea foam. Young men still race boats into dark waters, chasing packages dropped from passing ships. The southern route remains wide open, a highway of white powder and blood money that no amount of chains can close. In Netreg, they still whisper about Big Brother Jaggers. Some paint him as a Robin Hood, stealing from international cartels to feed his community. Others remember the mothers who buried children caught in his crossfire, the addicts who withered away on his product. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in that gray area where poverty and opportunity collide, where young men choose between slow starvation and fast money. Jaggers' story isn't unique. It's replicated in favelas and townships, in projects and barrios around the world. Poverty creates the soldiers. Prohibition creates the market. Geography creates the opportunity. Mix them together and you get men like Peter Jaggers, kings of nothing, rulers of ruin, chained to a system that consumes them as surely as the waters that finally claimed him. In the end, there's a brutal poetry to how it finished. A man who'd spent his life fishing cocaine from the sea ended up at the bottom of a dam. A boss who'd ruled through fear died afraid and alone. A king who'd built his throne on white powder was pulled down by the weight of his crown. The Colombians got their message across. The chains that bound Jaggers' body sent a signal to every would-be cocaine king from Cape Town to Cartagena. Steal from the cartel, and you won't just die, you'll disappear. You'll become a cautionary tale, a ghost story told in prison cells and trap houses. You'll sink into darkness with industrial chains wrapped around your chest, payment for a debt that can only be settled in blood. But here's the thing about messages written in murder. They never quite say what the killers intend. Because for every Peter Jaggers who ends up chained at the bottom of a dam, 10 more are watching from the shadows, learning from his mistakes, planning their own ascent. The game doesn't end with one dead king. It just resets, waits for the next shipment to drop into dark waters, for the next young man to convince himself he can beat the odds. Somewhere off the Cape Coast tonight, a container ship is slowing down. Somewhere in Netreg, a phone is ringing with coordinates. Somewhere in Colombia, accountants are tallying numbers that must, always must, add up. The southern route remains open. The cocaine keeps flowing. And the chains? They're still out there, waiting for the next king who thinks he can steal from gods and live to spend the money. Peter Jaggers learned too late that in the world of international drug trafficking, there are no kings, only pawns who've forgotten their place on the board. His reign ended not with a bang, but with a splash, weighted down by chains that told a simple truth. In this game, everybody sinks in the end. The only question is how deep you'll go before the water fills your lungs.